So we've already looked at the web developer tools somewhat within Chrome, but before we go any further, it's really important to understand exactly what we can do with these tools. Because when you're developing, you often just have your text editor open and you just have your browser open. And really, if you think about it, this is silly because there's no way to actually debug anything like you would with a normal programming language. So this is not a new thing, but within older browsers like Internet Explorer, you wouldn't normally find this. Now you can access this by either clicking here and then choosing, if we go up to Tools, Developer Tools, you probably can't see that, but the other option is to, if you're just working on a web page, maybe you've built up a few things on a page, or just clicking anywhere, right-clicking on the page and clicking Inspect Element, and then you can just browse through the structure of your markup of your page, so your markup here. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an element in, and we're not going to style it from the CSS file at all. We're going to do everything from the browser. So let's take a look at how we'll do this. So inside index.html, let's create a div element here, and maybe let's give this a class of box. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a box. We're going to give it a background color. We're going to give it a width and a height, and we're going to set the border radius, which will curve out the border edges. That's another new CSS property that we're going to look at. And we'll give it a border, perhaps some padding, just the normal things that we'd do for a box. In fact, let's add some text inside of here. First of all, I'm a box. So when you're developing up elements, this is a really quick way to work. So we have our box here, we inspect this element, and we have it selected in our developer tools. Now over here in the right hand side, you can see, as well as things like looking at the box model and stuff like that, we have element.style. Now let's back up a tiny little bit and just look at this. You can see that this here says user agent style sheet. Now what this basically means is the default styles that are given to a particular element before you've even written any CSS, because there needs to be some way that something is displayed on its own. So for example, let's take a look at some header elements. If we just cancel this off, and H1. Now we have H1, H2, H3 and so on, and these are basically headers for things. So it could be a page title, it could be an article header, it could be anything. So inside of this H1, I'm going to say this is a header, and we head over to the browser. Now you can see that this is automatically being given certain styles already. You can see that the orange is the padding, and we've got the display of block, which we've already seen with the div element. This fills up the entire width of the parent container. We've got a font size set to 2 ems. We've got the margin, the orange is the margin, not the padding. The padding is green. And we've got the font weight set to bold, which basically just bolds out the font. So we've got certain elements styled already in a certain way. So we see them from the Chrome developer tools. We wouldn't normally see that, so it's useful that we have it. For example, you can see the body already has a margin of 8 pixels in here, so that's automatically set. We can just override that if we want. So we could, inside of main.css, say, well, I want the body to have no margin at all. So remember, this affects the north, east, south and west, or the top, bottom, left and right. And therefore what happens is, you can see in here that it crosses out this one and it adds our one. And now you can see that this text is sat flush against the edge of the page. So let's start building up this box then. And we're going to do this within Chrome Developer Tools without touching our style sheet. We've already got a display of block, which we can keep. That's absolutely fine. We wouldn't want this to be a display of inline, which will sit inline against other elements. Things like anchors, span elements, which are sort of generic containers that aren't really for any particular purpose. They are a display of inline by default. So let's start to do this then. Let's give it a background color first of all. And all I've done is I've just clicked in here. basically. I've just clicked in here. Now you can style it on element.style, or you can click this plus button to create a new selector. And you can see here now we have inspector style sheet here. And this just means line 1, by the way, this :1. So under box, let's now say, well, I want the background color to be black. That's automatically changed there without having to refresh the page, without having to add anything to our style sheet. Brilliant. Now I'm going to say width, and I'm going to set this to 100 pixels. And I'm going to say height, and I'm going to set this to 100 pixels. I'm going to set the color to FFF. And by the way, to get down to the next line, I'm just tabbing down. I'm just pressing the tab key on my keyboard. I'm going to set the padding here to 10 pixels. And I'm going to set, in fact, let's change the background color. So I can just click in there. And I'm going to set the border down here. We just click in here. Border to 1 pixel, solid and black. And then I'm going to give this a margin of 10 pixels just to bring it out a little bit. So there we go. When you're learning, this is a really good way to play around with things. For example, I could click in this width and hit the up key on my keyboard, and you can see that will just increase the width for me, and I can go down again as well. So you can very, very easily play around with things within the browser and see how different elements affect other things without having to go back to your style sheet, typing out more code, back to your browser, or saving your file back to your browser, refreshing. It just means you can do it all within the browser. This will save you a lot of time and a lot of hassle. So once we've done here, don't refresh the page, because what that's going to do is you're going to lose all of your styles. All I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight these all. I'm going to press Control or Command and C just to copy these to the clipboard. You'll see now if we refresh, they all go, so make sure you don't do that. I've already copied them to the clipboard though, so what I can do is I can come down here, I can create my selector, and I can paste that in there. We have a couple of indentation issues, but we can just highlight them and indent them like so. So we've developed these styles within the browser, we've seen what the result already looks like. This is probably the most important thing. We know what the result looks like based on what we did in the browser. So now we know we're expecting exactly the same thing when we refresh. And you can see here now that instead of this being inspector style sheet on line 1 or whatever, we know that this class now starts on the main.css style sheet, which is the one that we have here, on line 5. It's telling us which line this is appearing on. And the fact that it's telling us which line it's appearing on is really, really useful, because if we were debugging something and we wanted to go over to our text editor and then find out which line something was on, we could easily just do something like that and go to line 5. It just happens that in Sublime Text I can press Control and P, do a :5, pretty much like we saw in Chrome DevTools, and that will take me straight to line 5. Or for example, I could go to line 10 or whatever. So that's how we style things within the browser. So we basically just styled this within the browser, and then we've put it into our style sheet. Let's take a quick look now at the network tab. This tells us how many resources that we're loading in, or how many things we're loading into our page. Now from a front-end perspective, you might not think that network speed or how you request things is anything to do with you. Well, what happens is whenever we load in an additional style sheet, whenever we load in a script, or even just our index page really, or images is another one which we'll come to later, what we're doing is we're creating an additional HTTP request to the server to fetch specific content. So just to demonstrate this, let's go ahead and create a new style sheet. And I'm going to call this, I don't know, home.css. So inside index, let's go ahead and create a new link to a style sheet. And a new href here, we're going to say css/home.css. Now, I said earlier when we created our style sheet that it's probably only a good idea, even if you split these up with some kind of preprocessor, which we're not going to go over. We don't want to create too many style sheets in here because it might seem innocent. We're just loading in styles and it's changing the display of the page. What's actually happening here is you can see with these little green things, we are taking an extra, 1 millisecond. It might not be a lot in terms of at the moment because we just have an empty file basically. But it's loading in and it is basically sending an additional HTTP request to say, fetch that content and bring it back to me. Now, when we refresh again, these are going to be cached. The browser will basically say, well, I'm going to cache these until something changes on the server. So that's absolutely fine. But in this case, we are actually slowing down the page. And when we start to use things like images, videos on the page, scripts, we're going to be generating lots and lots of HTTP requests, and therefore we're going to be slowing down the experience for the user using the website. So just bear in mind that keeping an eye on the network tab and having a look at what you're loading in terms of your style sheets is a really good thing to do, so we can see them there. Now, what you can also do is if you are perhaps inspecting another website, you're trying to look for styles or you're trying to look for anything, you can of course inspect the element and see which style sheet this is on. And in actual fact, if I double click this, we actually get a preview of this. But in the network tab, we can do the same thing. I can just click on this main.css and that'll open that for me. And I can find different information about this, so the preview and the response here, as well as the headers. In this case, it's just a request URL to that file because we're not on a web server. So there we go. We have taken a quick look at the developer tools, but there's more. As well as styles, we can actually modify the content of the page. So say, for example, I wanted to change the class of this to, I don't know, square. I can do so. So all I did is I double clicked on this and then I can just edit this attribute. What I can also do is click add attribute and I can add additional attributes on here. We've not looked at any other attributes, but if this was, for example, an anchor, we could go ahead and mess around with the href, where that links to, things like that. So let's take a look at that as an example. So let's create an anchor here. And we're not going to do anything with that at all. And I'm just going to get rid of all of these styles. Get rid of this file here. So we've got an empty anchor. So let's add some text to this first of all. So I'm going to say edit as HTML. And I can just go ahead and say click me, like so. And I click away. And there we go. We've got the text in there. Click me. So now I can add an attribute. So I can say href equals http google.co.uk, hit enter, and there we go. We've modified the HTML within here. When I click it, we go through to Google. Now you might be thinking, well, what's the use in doing that? You might want to add additional classes to elements and then style them up. You might want to modify the markup just to see how things react on the page if you were to change things. So for example, if you were to change this to a span element, in fact, let's just bring that styling back. Now a span element, as I mentioned earlier, is an inline by default. Here we have a block level by default, and we'll see how this is problematic if we change this to a span. Notice that when I change this side to a span, all I'm doing is double clicking on it. This is automatically changed for us. We don't need to edit both tags. Chrome will automatically work that out. Now things look a little bit weird here. It's sort of sat up further up the page than we thought. Everything's a little bit weird. And that's basically because this element is not a block level element. So we would have to go ahead and in here, as we saw before with the user agent style sheet, manually add in display block, and then that goes back to normal. So for example, anchors are a display of inline because they need to sit inline text. But in the next video, what we're going to be doing is actually looking at different display types for elements, which are, again, like the box model that we looked previously, really fundamental to understanding how things work on the page.